The humid Texas air hung heavy over Austin as the sun began its descent behind the city's iconic skyline. Jake Sullivan sat alone in the back corner of Murphy's Tavern, a dimly lit, honky-tonk bar on the east side of town where the smell of barbecue sauce and stale beer had seeped into the wooden walls over decades of late-night revelry. His calloused fingers moved mechanically across the frets of his father's old Martin acoustic guitar, playing a soft melody that seemed to echo the ache in his chest. At 22, Jake possessed the kind of rugged handsomeness that turned heads tall and lean, with sandy brown hair that fell across his forehead and piercing blue eyes that had once sparkled with mischief and dreams. Now, those same eyes carried a weight that made people look away, as if his pain was too raw, too real to witness. The deep scar running from his left temple to his jawline served as a permanent reminder of the night that had changed everything. The night his father, Michael Sullivan, had died in the twisted wreckage of their pickup truck on a rain-slicked highway outside of town. "Jake, honey, you need to eat something more substantial than those pretzels," called out Martha Henderson, the tavern's 50-something waitress who had been working there since before Jake was born. Her graying hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and her kind eyes crinkled at the corners from years of smiling at customers, even when her own life had handed her more than her share of heartbreak. She approached his table with a plate of chicken fried steak and mashed potatoes, setting it down despite his weak protests. "I'm fine, Miss Martha," Jake mumbled, not looking up from his guitar. His voice had grown quieter over the past 18 months, as if speaking too loudly might shatter what little composure he had left. "Tom said I could just sit here and play as long as I buy a drink every hour." Martha's weathered hand gently touched his shoulder. "Tom Wilson would let you live in this place rent-free if he could, and you know it. That man's got a soft spot for strays and broken hearts." She paused, studying Jake's gaunt face. "Your daddy wouldn't want you wasting away like this, son." Michael Sullivan was the kind of man who grabbed life by the horns and rode it till the whistle blew. The mention of his father's name hit Jake like a physical blow. He could still hear Michael's booming laugh echoing through their small ranch house on the outskirts of Austin, still smell the mixture of Old Spice and motor oil that seemed to cling to his father's work shirts. Michael had been a larger-than-life figure in Jake's world, a former rodeo cowboy turned mechanic who could fix anything with an engine and play guitar well enough to make the angels weep. "He's been gone almost 2 years now, Miss Martha," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes I can't even remember what his voice sounded like anymore." The truth was more complicated than that. Jake remembered everything about his father with painful clarity. Every Sunday morning, when Michael would make pancakes shaped like Texas while playing George Strait records on the old stereo. Every evening when they'd sit on the porch and his father would teach him new chord progressions. Every time Michael would tell him that music was the universal language of the heart and that Jake had been blessed with the gift to speak it fluently. But Jake hadn't played for anyone but himself since the accident. The thought of performing in front of people, of being watched and judged, filled him with a paralyzing anxiety that made his hands shake and his throat close up. The boy who had once dreamed of following in George Strait's footsteps now couldn't even order a burger without stumbling over his words. As if summoned by his thoughts, the opening notes of Amarillo Morning began playing on the tavern's sound system. Jake's fingers instinctively found the familiar chord progression on his guitar, playing along quietly. George Strait's smooth voice filled the smoky air, and for a moment Jake could almost feel his father's presence beside him. "You know," Martha said, settling into the chair across from him, "there's been talk around town about that big concert coming up. George Strait's doing some kind of special show at the Frank Irwin Center next month. Folks are saying it's going to be his biggest performance in Austin in years." Jake's hands stilled on the guitar strings. He had heard the rumors, Seen the posters going up around town advertising the King of Country's Austin homecoming. Part of him desperately wanted to go, to experience the magic of seeing his idol perform live. But the larger part of him, the part that had been broken and rebuilt with fear instead of hope, couldn't imagine being in a crowd of thousands of people. "I heard tickets sold out in about 10 minutes, Jake said, focusing intently on retuning his guitar to avoid making eye contact. "Probably for the best. I'm not much for crowds these days." Martha leaned forward, her maternal instincts clearly kicking in. "Jake Sullivan, I've known you since you were knee-high to a grasshopper, and I remember when you used to get up on that little stage over there and play for anyone who'd listen. You had a gift, honey. Your daddy used to say you could make a room full of strangers feel like family with just a few notes." The memory hit Jake like a sucker punch. He was 14, standing on Murphy's small stage during their weekly open mic night, playing Troubadour, while his father beamed with pride from the audience. The crowd had given him a standing ovation, and afterward, an older gentleman had approached them saying Jake reminded him of a young George Strait. "That was a long time ago," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm not that kid anymore." "No, you're not," Martha agreed, her tone gentle but firm. "You're a man who's been through hell and back, but that doesn't mean the music died with your daddy, Jake. It just means it's waiting for you to find it again." The tavern's front door opened with a blast of hot evening air, and Linda Sullivan walked in, her nurse's scrubs still wrinkled from a long shift at St. David's Hospital. At 48, Jake's mother retained the natural beauty that had caught Michael's eye at a high school football game 30 years ago. But grief had added silver streaks to her auburn hair and deepened the lines around her green eyes. "There you are," Linda said, sliding into the booth beside Martha. "I should have known I'd find you here." Jake felt a familiar pang of guilt. His mother worked double shifts to keep their small house, and here he was, hiding out in a bar instead of looking for steady work or helping with the bills. The insurance money from his father's accident had covered the funeral and some debts, but it hadn't been enough to secure their future. "I was just finishing up," Jake said, starting to pack his guitar into its worn case. "Actually," Linda said, reaching into her purse and pulling out a folded newspaper, "I wanted to show you something." She spread the Austin American-Statesman on the table, pointing to a small advertisement in the entertainment section. "Look at this." Jake squinted at the text. "Calling all local talent. Opening act auditions for George Strait's Austin homecoming. Singer-songwriters and musicians of all ages welcome. Auditions held at, and on quiet evenings, when he sat on his apartment balcony with his father's old guitar, Jake could swear he heard Michael's voice harmonizing with his own, reminding him that love never really dies. It just transforms into something more beautiful, something that can be shared with the world through the universal language of music. 6 months later, Jake received a call that would have seemed impossible during his darkest days. George Strait's people wanted to know if he would be interested in opening for the King of Country on his farewell tour. Not just one show, but 30 dates across Texas and the Southwest. As Jake hung up the phone and looked around his small apartment, at the gold records beginning to line his walls, at the photos of him performing with his heroes, at the life he was building note by note and song by song, he thought about the scared, broken young man who had once been afraid to order coffee in public. That version of himself felt like a character from someone else's story now. In his place stood Jake Sullivan, musician, performer, and living proof that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the places where we thought we were too broken to sing. His father would have been proud, but more importantly, Jake was finally proud of himself. The phone rang again, Emma calling to congratulate him on the tour news, her voice bright with love and excitement. As Jake answered, already planning how they would celebrate this latest milestone, he realized that the best part of success wasn't the recognition, or the money, or even the fulfillment of childhood dreams. The best part was having people to share it with. People who had believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself, people who had helped him transform his pain into something beautiful enough to offer the world. Outside his window, the Austin skyline glittered in the evening light, and somewhere in the distance, a street musician was playing Amarillo Morning on an old acoustic guitar. Jake smiled, picked up his own guitar and began to play along. After all, some songs were meant to be shared. Total word count, approximately 72,000 characters. This story chronicles Jake Sullivan's journey from grief-stricken isolation to triumphant return to the stage, culminating in his life-changing encounter with George Strait. The narrative explores themes of loss, healing, friendship, and the transformative power of music, while staying grounded in the authentic culture and landscape of Austin, Texas. The climactic moment, George Strait inviting Jake on stage, serves as both the fulfillment of a dream and the catalyst for Jake's new life as a professional musician, honoring his father's memory while forging his own path forward. Tones Music Hall, Saturday, July 15th. Winner receives $1,000 and the opportunity to open for the King of Country himself. Jake's heart began racing, but not with excitement. The thought of auditioning, of standing in front of judges and potentially hundreds of other hopefuls made his palms sweat and his chest tighten. "Mom, I can't—" "I know what you're thinking," Linda interrupted, covering his hand with hers. "But Jake, you've been hiding from the world for almost 2 years. Your father didn't raise you to give up on your dreams because life knocked you down." "My dreams died with Dad," Jake said, the words coming out harsher than he intended. "I'm not built for performing anymore. I can barely order coffee without my hands shaking." Martha and Linda exchanged a look that Jake pretended not to notice. He knew they meant well, but they didn't understand the crushing weight of anxiety that had settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket. The panic attacks that came without warning, the way his vision would tunnel and his breathing would become shallow whenever he found himself the center of attention. "What if we started small?" Linda suggested, her voice taking on the patient tone she used with difficult patients at the hospital. "There's that little cafe on South First where they have acoustic nights. Maybe you could—" "No." Jake's voice was firm, final. "I'm sorry, Mom, but I'm just not ready for any of that. Maybe I never will be." He stood up, slinging his guitar case over his shoulder. "I'll walk home. I need the air." As Jake headed for the door, Martha called after him. "Your daddy used to say that courage isn't about not being afraid, honey. It's about doing what needs to be done even when you're scared to death." Jake paused at the doorway, his father's words echoing in his memory. Michael had said something similar on the day Jake had been nervous about his first guitar lesson. "Fear's just your mind trying to keep you safe, son, but sometimes the safest place is right on the other side of what scares you most." The irony wasn't lost on Jake. His father had died because he hadn't been afraid enough, driving too fast on a wet road, trying to get home in time to hear Jake play at the tavern's Saturday night showcase. If Michael had been more cautious, more afraid, he might still be alive. Jake stepped out into the humid Austin evening, the sounds of the city washing over him like a familiar song. 6th Street was already coming alive with tourists and college students, but Jake turned away from the crowds, heading toward the quieter residential streets that would eventually lead him home. As he walked, his phone buzzed with a text message from his best friend since childhood, Bobby Martinez. "Dude, did you see that George Strait thing in the paper? We should totally audition. Remember how we used to talk about playing the Irwin Center someday?" Jake stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Some dreams, he told himself, were meant to stay buried with the people who believed in them most. But as he continued his solitary walk home, Jake found himself humming Troubadour under his breath, and for just a moment he could swear he heard his father's voice harmonizing along. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window of the Sullivan house, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. Jake sat at the worn Formica table, staring at a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, while his mother bustled around, getting ready for another shift at the hospital. The newspaper from the night before lay folded beside his elbow, the audition advertisement still visible despite his attempts to ignore it. "I left some leftover casserole in the fridge," Linda said, pausing to kiss the top of Jake's head. "Mrs. Peterson next door made it, and you know how she gets when people don't eat her food." Eleanor Peterson was a 70-year-old widow who had appointed herself the unofficial caretaker of their neighborhood. She had been bringing covered dishes to the Sullivan household ever since Michael's funeral, as if food could somehow fill the void left by his absence. "I'll make sure to have some," Jake promised, though he had little appetite these days. Everything tasted like cardboard, another symptom of the depression that seemed to follow him like a shadow. Linda hesitated at the door, her keys jingling in her hand. "Jake, I know you don't want to hear this, but Dr. Rodriguez at the hospital thinks you might benefit from talking to someone. A professional, I mean. There's no shame in—" "I'm fine, Mom," Jake interrupted, though they both knew it was far from the truth. "Just give me some time, okay? I'll figure things out." After Linda left for work, Jake found himself alone with his thoughts and the persistent melody of Amarillo Morning that seemed to play on an endless loop in his head. He picked up his guitar from where it leaned against the living room wall and settled onto the couch, his fingers finding the familiar chords without conscious thought. The house felt different without his father's presence. Michael had been one of those people who filled a room just by walking into it, whose laughter could chase away any darkness. Now the rooms felt hollow, echoing with memories of better times. Jake's eyes drifted to the mantelpiece, where a framed photo of him and Michael at last year's rodeo sat beside his father's old cowboy hat. A knock at the door interrupted his melancholy reverie. Jake set down his guitar and peered through the peephole to see Emma Rodriguez standing on his front porch, holding what appeared to be a plate of cookies. He had known Emma since high school, though they had never been particularly close. She was a year younger than him, with long black hair and warm brown eyes that always seemed to be smiling, even when her mouth wasn't. "Hi, Jake," Emma said when he opened the door, her voice carrying a slight musical lilt that betrayed her Mexican heritage. "I hope I'm not bothering you. My mom made way too many snickerdoodles and she insisted I bring some over." Emma's mother, Dr. Carmen Rodriguez, was a pediatrician who worked with Linda at the hospital. The two women had become close friends over the years, bonding over their shared experiences as single mothers, trying to raise children in an increasingly complicated world. "That's really nice of her," Jake said, accepting the plate. "And you, I mean, for bringing them over." He noticed Emma was carrying a guitar case, a beautiful Gibson acoustic that looked well loved but carefully maintained. She followed his gaze and smiled. "I was actually on my way to an open mic at the Saxon pub. Thursday nights are kind of my thing." She paused, seeming to weigh her words carefully. "You should come sometime. It's a really supportive crowd, mostly singer-songwriters and people who just love music." The suggestion made Jake's chest tighten with familiar anxiety. "I don't really do crowds anymore," he said, trying to keep his voice casual. "But thanks for thinking of me." Emma studied his face with the kind of perceptive gaze that made Jake feel uncomfortably exposed. "I remember hearing you play at Murphy's a few years ago," she said quietly. "You were incredible. The way you played Whiskey River. It was like Willie Nelson himself was in the room." Jake shifted uncomfortably, gripping the plate of cookies like a shield. "That was a long time ago." "Not that long," Emma countered, "and talent like that doesn't just disappear because life gets hard." She hefted her guitar case. "Look, I know we don't know each other that well, but I lost my dad when I was 16. Heart attack completely out of nowhere. I stopped singing for 2 years because every song reminded me of him. Jake felt something stir in his chest, recognition perhaps, or simply relief that someone understood the particular flavor of his grief. "What changed?" he asked. Emma's smile was tinged with sadness. "I realized that honoring his memory meant embracing the parts of myself he loved most. My dad used to say that music was God's way of proving that beauty could exist even in a broken world." She adjusted the strap of her guitar case. "I started playing again because staying silent felt like letting him down." Before Jake could respond, a familiar pickup truck rumbled to a stop in front of the house. Tom Wilson emerged from the driver's seat, his weathered face creased with concern. Tom was in his 60s, with silver hair and the kind of hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. He had owned Murphy's Tavern for over 30 years, and in that time, he had become something of a father figure to half the musicians in Austin. "Jake, son," Tom called out, walking up the front path with the slightly bow-legged gait of a man who had spent too many years on horseback. "I was hoping I might catch you at home." "Hey, Mr. Wilson," Jake replied, suddenly feeling like he was back in high school and about to get in trouble for something. "Is everything okay?" Tom tipped his hat to Emma, ever the gentleman, before turning his attention back to Jake. "Well, that depends on your definition of okay. I've got a proposition for you, and I hope you'll hear me out before you say no." Jake's stomach dropped. He had a feeling he knew where this conversation was heading. "You know, that little stage at the back of the tavern," Tom continued. "The one where your daddy used to love watching you play? Well, I've been thinking it's been too quiet lately. Dead quiet, you might say. I could use someone to play there a couple of nights a week, maybe Thursday and Saturday. Nothing fancy, just background music for the folks who want to enjoy a beer and some good tunes." "Mr. Wilson, I appreciate the offer, but—" "Before you say no," Tom interrupted, holding up a weathered hand, "hear me out. You'd be playing for tips plus $50 a night. The stage is in the back corner, so it's not like you'd be front and center. Most folks would just be listening with half an ear while they shoot pool or eat their dinner." Emma glanced between the two men, clearly sensing the undercurrents of the conversation. "Maybe I should go," she said. "Actually," Tom said, turning to her with interest, "aren't you Carmen Rodriguez's girl? The one who sings at the Saxon?" "Yes, sir," Emma replied, her cheeks coloring slightly. "I've heard good things about your voice," Tom said. "Real good things. In fact, I was thinking maybe Jake here could use a singing partner for these little performances. Take some of the pressure off, you know?" Jake felt trapped, cornered by two well-meaning people who didn't understand that performing, even in a small, dimly lit bar, felt impossible. His hands were already starting to shake at the thought of people watching him, judging him, waiting for him to fail. "I can't," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, but I just can't." Tom's expression softened. "Son, I knew your daddy for 15 years, and in all that time I never met a man more proud of his boy. Michael used to tell anyone who'd listen that you were going to be the next George Strait. He'd sit at the bar after your performances with this grin that could light up the whole state of Texas." The mention of his father's pride hit Jake like a physical blow. He could picture Michael sitting at the bar, buying rounds for strangers while bragging about his son's musical talent. "That's exactly why I can't do it," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "Because every time I think about playing music, all I can think about is how he's not here to see it anymore. How he died because he was rushing to watch me play some stupid showcase that didn't even matter." The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and acrid. Jake immediately regretted saying them, but there they were, the truth he had been carrying around like a stone in his chest for almost 2 years. Emma stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. "Jake, what happened to your father wasn't your fault. You know that, right?" "Do I?" Jake laughed bitterly. "Because if I hadn't been performing that night, if he hadn't been trying to get there in time, he'd still be alive. Every song I play is a reminder of that." Tom removed his hat and ran his fingers through his silver hair. Son, your daddy was coming to that showcase because music made you happy, and your happiness was the most important thing in his world. Blaming yourself for his love is like blaming the sun for shining. Jake felt tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. He hadn't cried since the funeral, hadn't allowed himself that luxury. Grief was something to be carried, not released. "I need to think about it," he said finally, knowing even as he spoke that his mind was already made up. He couldn't perform. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Tom nodded, settling his hat back on his head. "That's all I ask. But Jake, don't let fear make your decisions for you. Your daddy wouldn't want that." After Tom left, Emma lingered on the porch, her guitar case at her feet like a faithful dog waiting for its next walk. "I'm sorry if we ambushed you," she said. "That wasn't the intention." Jake shook his head. "It's fine. Everyone means well. But they don't understand that some things can't be fixed with good intentions and tough love." "Maybe not," Emma agreed. "But sometimes they can be fixed with time and the right kind of support." She picked up her guitar case. "The offer stands, by the way. If you ever change your mind about playing together, I'd be honored. No pressure, no expectations, just two people making music because that's what we're meant to do." As Emma walked toward her car, Jake found himself calling after her. "Emma?" She turned back, hope flickering in her dark eyes. "That thing you said about honoring your father's memory by embracing what he loved most about you. How do you know you're doing it right?" Emma's smile was radiant, transforming her entire face. "You don't, really. You just trust that love is stronger than fear, and that the people who truly love us want us to be happy more than they want us to be safe." After Emma drove away, Jake sat on his front porch for a long time, watching the sun climb higher in the Texas sky. The newspaper with the Strait audition announcement sat beside him, rustling occasionally in the hot breeze. He thought about his father's calloused hands, teaching him his first chord progression, about the way Michael's eyes would light up when Jake mastered a particularly difficult song. He thought about Emma's courage in sharing her own story of loss and recovery, and about Tom's unwavering faith in his abilities. Most of all, he thought about the guitar sitting silent in his living room, waiting for him to find the courage to let it sing again. As if summoned by his thoughts, his phone buzzed with another text from Bobby Martinez. "Bro, seriously, we should talk about this Strait thing. I know you're going through stuff, but this could be huge. Call me?" Jake stared at the message for a long moment, then surprised himself by typing back, "Coffee tomorrow, Ruta Maya at 10? The response came immediately. "Finally. Yes. See you there." Jake slipped his phone back into his pocket and picked up the newspaper, reading the audition announcement one more time. The deadline was still 3 weeks away. Plenty of time to talk himself out of whatever crazy idea was starting to form in the back of his mind. But for the first time in almost 2 years, Jake Sullivan allowed himself to imagine stepping back onto a stage, guitar in hand, his father's memory shining like a beacon in the darkness of his fear. Ruta Maya Cafe buzzed with the familiar energy of a Friday morning in Austin, laptop-wielding freelancers claiming corner tables, university students fueling up on caffeine before classes, and the ever-present soundtrack of indie folk music drifting from speakers mounted near the exposed brick walls. Jake arrived 10 minutes early, partly from nervousness and partly because he wanted to secure a table in the back corner where fewer people would overhear their conversation. Bobby Martinez burst through the front door at exactly 10 o'clock, his infectious grin preceding him like a herald announcing good news. At 23, Bobby possessed the kind of natural charisma that made strangers feel like old friends within minutes of meeting him. His black hair was perpetually tousled, as if he had just rolled out of bed, and his brown eyes sparkled with the kind of mischief that had gotten them both into trouble more times than Jake cared to remember during their teenage years. "Jake Sullivan," Bobby announced loudly enough for half the cafe to hear. "You magnificent reclusive bastard. I was starting to think you'd been abducted by aliens." Several patrons looked over with mild curiosity, and Jake felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment. This was exactly why he preferred staying home. Bobby had never met a spotlight he didn't want to step into, while Jake increasingly felt more comfortable in the shadows. "Keep it down, Bobby," Jake muttered, gesturing to the chair across from him. "The whole city doesn't need to know I'm here." Bobby slid into the seat with characteristic enthusiasm, already signaling to the barista for his usual, a triple shot cortado with extra foam. "Dude, you look terrible. I mean, I know you've been going through it, but seriously, when was the last time you slept or ate something that wasn't made of processed cheese and regret?" Jake ran a hand through his unwashed hair, suddenly self-conscious about his appearance. Bobby was dressed in his usual uniform of dark jeans and a vintage band t-shirt that somehow looked effortlessly cool, while Jake felt like he had crawled out of a cave wearing yesterday's clothes and tomorrow's anxieties. "I sleep fine," Jake lied, "and I eat plenty." "Uh-huh." Bobby leaned back in his chair, studying his best friend with the kind of penetrating gaze that came from 20 years of friendship. "So let's cut to the chase. This George Strait thing. Are we doing it or what?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Jake had been dreading and anticipating this conversation in equal measure ever since he had sent the text agreeing to meet. "Bobby, I can't even order coffee without my voice shaking," Jake said quietly. "How am I supposed to audition for the biggest country music star in Texas? With your guitar and your voice, same as always," Bobby replied matter-of-factly. "Look, I get it. What happened to your dad was... fuck, man. It was terrible, but he wouldn't want you to give up on everything that made you happy just because he's not here to see it." Jake flinched at the casual mention of his father's death. Most people, including his mother and the well-meaning folks at Murphy's Tavern, tiptoed around the subject as if speaking Michael's name too loudly might somehow make Jake's grief worse. But Bobby had always been brutally direct, a quality that Jake both appreciated and found exhausting. "It's not that simple," Jake said. "Every time I think about performing, I have these panic attacks. My hands shake, I can't breathe, and I feel like I'm going to pass out or throw up or both." "Okay, so we work on that," Bobby said, as if anxiety were a leaky faucet that could be fixed with the right tools and enough determination. "My cousin Danny had panic attacks after he came back from Afghanistan. He said the key was starting small and building up your tolerance." Jake wanted to argue that combat-related PTSD was hardly comparable to his situation, but something in Bobby's tone stopped him. There was a sincerity there that he rarely heard from his perpetually optimistic friend. "What are you suggesting?" Jake asked. Bobby's eyes lit up like a kid on Christmas morning. "Baby steps, my man. We start with just you and me, maybe in your living room or my garage. No pressure, no audience, just two friends playing music like we used to do in high school." The memory of those teenage jam sessions hit Jake with unexpected force. He and Bobby had spent countless hours in the Martinez family's converted garage, working through covers of their favorite songs and dreaming about the day they would share a stage with their heroes. Bobby had been a decent rhythm guitarist, but he was an even better hype man, always pushing Jake to try more challenging songs and celebrating every small victory like it was a Grammy win. "I don't know, Bobby. It's been so long since I played with anyone else." "Exactly my point," Bobby said, leaning forward with renewed intensity. "You've been isolating yourself for almost 2 years. Don't you think it's time to let someone back in?" Before Jake could respond, a familiar voice called out from across the cafe. "Jake? Jake Sullivan?" Jake turned to see Emma Rodriguez approaching their table, her long black hair pulled back in a ponytail and a canvas messenger bag slung across her shoulder. She was wearing a simple sundress that somehow made her look both professional and approachable, like someone who could give a boardroom presentation and then sing lullabies to children with equal grace. "Emma, hi," Jake said, half rising from his seat in a gesture of politeness that his father had drilled into him since childhood. "This is my friend Bobby Martinez. Bobby, Emma Rodriguez." "Ah, the famous Emma," Bobby said, extending his hand with a theatrical flourish. "Jake mentioned you stopped by yesterday. I'm the best friend who's trying to convince this stubborn jackass to stop hiding from the world." Emma laughed, a sound like wind chimes caught in a gentle breeze. "Well, we have that in common then. Mind if I join you? I was just grabbing coffee before my shift at the music store." Jake gestured to an empty chair, and Emma settled in with the easy grace of someone comfortable in her own skin. She worked at Waterloo Records, Jake remembered, which explained her encyclopedic knowledge of local musicians and venues. "So," Emma said, accepting the cortado that Bobby gallantly offered to buy for her, "Bobby's trying to get Jake back on stage." "Trying and failing spectacularly," Bobby admitted with a rueful grin. "But I'm nothing if not persistent. I figure if I wear him down with enough coffee and emotional manipulation, he'll eventually cave." "That's actually not a terrible strategy," Emma said, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "Though you might want to add some positive reinforcement to the mix. Jake's got serious talent, the kind that shouldn't be wasted sitting alone in an empty house." Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I'm sitting right here, you know. You don't have to talk about me like I'm not present." "Sorry," Emma said, though her tone suggested she wasn't particularly sorry at all. "It's just that hiding exceptional ability feels almost criminal to those of us who have to work twice as hard to sound half as good." "You have a beautiful voice," Jake protested, remembering the few times he had heard Emma sing at local venues. "That song you did at the Saxon pub last month, 'Breathe Me In,' it was incredible." Emma looked genuinely surprised that Jake had been paying attention to her performances. "You were there?" Jake nodded, feeling suddenly exposed. "I sometimes sit in the parking lot and listen through the open doors. It's easier than going inside." The admission hung in the air like a confession, revealing just how far Jake's social anxiety had progressed. There was a time when he would have been embarrassed to admit such behavior, but now he felt too emotionally exhausted to maintain pretenses. Bobby and Emma exchanged a look that Jake pretended not to notice, the kind of wordless communication that passed between people who recognized a mutual mission. "You know what?" Emma said, as if the idea had just occurred to her. "What if we made this even easier? Bobby, do you still have access to your family's garage?" "Yeah, why? What if we started there? Just the three of us, completely private. No pressure to perform or impress anyone, just playing music because it feels good." Jake felt his automatic no forming on his lips, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the genuine care in Emma's voice, or the hopeful expression on Bobby's face, or simply the fact that he was tired of being afraid of everything. The constant vigilance required to avoid potentially triggering situations was exhausting, and for the first time in months, Jake found himself wondering what it would feel like to just let go. "What would we play?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. Bobby's grin could have powered half of Austin. "Whatever you want, man. Country, folk, blues, classic rock. I'm easy. I just want to hear you play something other than sad bastard music for once." "I don't play sad bastard music," Jake protested weakly. "Dude, the other night at Murphy's, you played The Dance 3 times in a row," Bobby said. "That song is basically emotional waterboarding set to a waltz tempo." Emma laughed. "Okay, but it's a beautiful song. Garth Brooks wrote it about how love is worth the pain, even when you know it's going to end badly. See?" Bobby gestured emphatically at Emma. "She gets it, and she still thinks it's depressing." "I never said it was depressing," Emma corrected. I said it was beautiful. There's a difference. Some of the most beautiful things in the world are also the saddest. Jake found himself thinking about his father's funeral, about how the church had been packed with people whose lives Michael had touched in small but meaningful ways. The service had been heartbreaking and beautiful in equal measure, a testament to a life fully lived despite its abrupt ending. "What if I have a panic attack?" Jake asked quietly. "What if I start playing and just fall apart?" Emma reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. Her touch was warm and steady, anchoring him to the present moment in a way that surprised him. "Then we'll stop," she said simply. "No judgment, no pressure to push through it. We'll just stop, take some deep breaths, and try again when you're ready. Or not try again at all if that's what you need." Bobby nodded enthusiastically. "Absolutely. This isn't boot camp, Jake. It's just 3 friends hanging out and making music. If it sucks, we'll order pizza and complain about how all the good songs have already been written." Jake looked between his 2 friends. Bobby, whose optimism was as reliable as sunrise, and Emma, whose quiet strength reminded him of his mother's resilience in the face of unthinkable loss. For the first time in months, he felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. "Okay," he said, the word coming out barely above a whisper. "We can try. But I'm not promising anything." Bobby's whoop of excitement was loud enough to turn heads throughout the cafe, but Jake found that he didn't care as much as he usually would. Emma's smile was radiant, transforming her entire face in a way that made Jake's heart skip a beat. "How about tomorrow afternoon?" Emma suggested. "I get off work at 3, so maybe around 4. "Perfect," Bobby said, already pulling out his phone to add the appointment to his calendar. "I'll text you my address, Emma. And Jake, I'll pick you up at 3:30 so you can't chicken out." "I wasn't planning to chicken out," Jake protested, though they all knew it was entirely possible. "Sure you weren't," Bobby said with a knowing grin. "That's why I'm not giving you the opportunity." As they prepared to leave, Emma gathered her messenger bag and stood to go. "Jake," she said, "I know this feels scary right now, but I want you to know that what you're doing takes real courage. It would be easier to stay safe and isolated forever." "It doesn't feel brave," Jake admitted. "It feels terrifying." "That's exactly what makes it brave," Emma replied, leaning down to kiss his cheek in a gesture that was both sisterly and something more. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what matters despite being afraid." After Emma left for work, Jake and Bobby lingered over their coffee, the comfortable silence of old friendship settling between them. "She's something else," Bobby said finally, watching Emma through the cafe window as she walked toward her car. "Yeah, she is," Jake agreed, touching his cheek where Emma's lips had briefly made contact. He could still smell her perfume, something light and floral that reminded him of his mother's garden in springtime. "You know she likes you, right?" Bobby said with characteristic bluntness. "And I don't mean in a let's be friends and make music together kind of way." Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks. "Bobby, don't." "I'm just saying, man, life's short. Dad taught us that, in his own fucked up way. Maybe it's time to start taking some chances on things that might make you happy." The mention of Michael hit Jake in an unexpected place. Not the familiar ache of loss, but something warmer and more complex. His father had been a romantic at heart, the kind of man who brought Linda wildflowers just because it was Tuesday, and who still held her hand during movies after 25 years of marriage. "I'm not ready for that," Jake said quietly. "I can barely handle the idea of playing music again, let alone—" "I know," Bobby said, his tone gentling. "But maybe they're connected, you know. Maybe learning to open up musically will help you open up in other ways too." Jake thought about that as they walked out into the blazing Austin heat. The idea that healing might be possible, that he might someday feel whole enough to offer himself to another person, seemed almost too much to hope for. But as he climbed into Bobby's beat-up Honda Civic, Jake found himself looking forward to tomorrow afternoon with something that felt dangerously close to excitement. The rest of the day passed in a blur of nervous energy and second-guessing. Jake cleaned his guitar obsessively, changed the strings twice, and practiced scales until his fingertips were sore. He called his mother at work 3 times, ostensibly to check in, but really seeking reassurance that he wasn't making a terrible mistake. "Honey, I think this is wonderful," Linda said during their third conversation, her voice warm with the kind of maternal pride that made Jake's chest tight with emotion. "Your father would be so proud of you for taking this step." "What if I make a fool of myself?" Jake asked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at him all day. "Then you'll be in excellent company," Linda replied with a laugh. "Some of the best musicians in the world have made fools of themselves at one time or another. It's practically a rite of passage." That evening, Jake found himself at Murphy's Tavern earlier than usual, seeking the comfort of familiar surroundings and Martha's maternal presence. The dinner crowd was thin, a few regulars at the bar, a couple sharing nachos in a corner booth, and an older gentleman nursing a beer while reading a paperback Western novel. "Well, look who's early tonight," Martha said, approaching his usual table with a glass of sweet tea and a knowing smile. "Tom told me about his little proposition yesterday. I hope you're giving it some serious thought." "Actually," Jake said, surprising himself with the admission, "I'm meeting some friends tomorrow to play music. Just informally, nothing major." Martha's face lit up like a Christmas tree. "Jake Sullivan, that's the best news I've heard all week. Who are you playing with?" "Bobby Martinez, you remember him from high school, and Emma Rodriguez, Dr. Rodriguez's daughter." "Oh, Emma's a lovely girl," Martha said warmly. "She comes in here sometimes with her guitar, just to listen to the music. Always very polite, always tips well. And she's got a voice like honey and heartbreak rolled into one." Jake found himself smiling at Martha's description. It was accurate in a way that made him realize he had been paying more attention to Emma's performances than he had consciously acknowledged. "We're just going to see how it goes," Jake said. "No pressure, no expectations." "That's exactly how it should be," Martha agreed. "Music should be joy first, everything else second." As if summoned by their conversation about music, the sound system began playing Check Yes or No by George Strait. The familiar opening chords sent a jolt through Jake's system, not the usual pang of loss, but something closer to anticipation. "You know," Martha said, settling into the chair across from him, "I heard the most interesting rumor today. Apparently George Strait's people have been scouting local venues, looking for authentic Austin atmosphere for some kind of documentary they're filming about the concert." Jake's heart skipped a beat. "What kind of documentary?" "Something about the connection between established stars and up-and-coming local talent," Martha said, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "Word is, they might even feature some local musicians in the film." The implications of Martha's words hit Jake like a thunderbolt. If George Strait's production team was actively looking for local talent, the audition competition would be even more intense than he had imagined. The thought should have terrified him. But instead, Jake felt something that might have been determination stirring in his chest. "Martha," he said slowly, "do you really think I'm good enough to compete with professional musicians?" Martha's expression grew serious. "Jake, honey, I've been listening to live music in this town for more than 30 years. I've heard wannabes and has-beens and never-weres, and I've heard a few genuine articles too. You, my dear boy, are the real thing. You've got that indefinable something that can't be taught or faked, the ability to make people feel like you're singing directly to their hearts." The compliment made Jake's throat tight with emotion. He thought about his father's unwavering belief in his talent, about the way Michael's face would light up whenever Jake played. Maybe it was time to honor that faith by taking a real chance on himself. "I should probably get home," Jake said, though he made no move to leave. "Big day tomorrow." "Jake," Martha said, reaching across to squeeze his hand, "whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to remember something your daddy used to say. He'd sit right here at this table after your performances and tell anyone who'd listen, "That boy doesn't just play music, he channels something divine." Jake felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. He could picture Michael holding court at this very table, his chest puffed with paternal pride and his eyes bright with whiskey and joy. "He really said that?" "Every single time," Martha confirmed. "And Jake?" He was right. As Jake finally gathered his things to leave, he felt something shift inside him, a loosening of the tight knot of fear and guilt that had lived in his chest since the accident. It wasn't gone entirely, but it felt manageable somehow, like something he might be able to work with, rather than something that controlled him completely. Walking home through the warm Austin evening, Jake found himself humming "Amarillo Morning" under his breath. But for the first time in almost 2 years, the melody didn't make him think about loss and endings. Instead, it made him think about Emma's smile, about Bobby's unshakable faith in their friendship, and about the possibility that tomorrow might be the first day of something new, rather than another day of mourning something that was gone forever. When he reached his house, Jake paused on the front porch to look up at the star-filled Texas sky. "I don't know if you can hear me, Dad," he whispered into the darkness, "but I'm going to try. I'm going to try to be the man you believed I could be." The night air was still and quiet, but Jake could have sworn he felt something like approval in the gentle breeze that rustled through the oak trees lining his street. The Martinez family garage had been converted into a makeshift recording studio sometime during Bobby's junior year of high school, when his dreams of rock stardom had reached their peak. Old Persian rugs covered the concrete floor, foam padding lined the walls to improve acoustics, and a collection of mismatched amplifiers and sound equipment created a maze of cables and possibility. The space smelled like motor oil and teenage ambition, overlaid with the lingering aroma of Maria Martinez's famous tamales from the kitchen next door. Jake arrived at exactly 4 o'clock, his guitar case clutched in one hand and a bottle of water in the other, both serving as talismans against the anxiety that had been building all day. Bobby had indeed picked him up 30 minutes early, chattering nervously about everything and nothing during the short drive across town. Now, standing in the familiar space where they had spent countless hours during their youth, Jake felt the weight of memory and possibility pressing down on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Emma was already there, tuning her Gibson acoustic with the kind of focused precision that spoke of years of professional-level musicianship. She had changed out of her work clothes into worn jeans and a vintage Stevie Ray Vaughan t-shirt that somehow made her look both casual and effortlessly cool. Her long black hair was pulled back in a loose bun, and she wore no makeup, which only served to highlight the natural beauty that Jake was beginning to notice with increasing frequency. "There he is," Bobby announced unnecessarily, his voice pitched slightly higher than normal with nervous energy. "The prodigal guitarist returns to his ancestral homeland." "Hey, Jake," Emma said, looking up from her guitar with a smile that seemed to contain equal parts warmth and understanding. "How are you feeling?" Jake set down his guitar case and flexed his fingers, trying to work out the stiffness that came from gripping the handle too tightly. "Terrified," he admitted, "but also kind of excited. I haven't felt excited about anything in so long, I'd almost forgotten what it felt like." "That's good," Emma said, standing up to give him a quick hug that surprised him with its naturalness. "Excitement is just fear with better marketing." Bobby had busied himself with setting up a small circle of folding chairs and adjusting the position of an ancient PV amplifier that had seen better decades. The garage was warm, despite the industrial fan whirring in one corner, and Jake could hear the sounds of suburban Austin filtering in through the open door, children playing in nearby yards, the distant hum of traffic on Mopac, a neighbor's dog barking at some perceived threat. "So," Bobby said, plopping down in one of the chairs with his own guitar, a battered Fender Stratocaster, that had been his pride and joy since his 16th birthday. What should we start with? Something easy, something hard, something we all know. Jake opened his guitar case with hands that were only slightly trembling. The Martin D28 had been his father's before it became his, and the wood still held the ghost of Michael's cologne and the accumulated warmth of thousands of hours of playing. Seeing it in this context, not as a solitary refuge, but as part of an ensemble, felt both foreign and right. Maybe something we all know, Jake suggested, settling the guitar across his lap and running his fingers over the familiar fretboard. Just to, I don't know, break the ice. Friends in Low Places, Emma suggested. Everyone knows that one, and it's got a great sing-along quality. Bobby's face lit up. Perfect. Garth Brooks is basically the gateway drug to country music anyway. Jake nodded, finding the opening chord progression on his guitar. The first few notes rang out in the enclosed space, clear and true, and he felt something loosen in his chest. This was just music, just friends, just the simple pleasure of making sound and harmony in a world that often felt discordant and harsh. Emma's voice joined in first, her alto weaving around the melody with a confidence that spoke of countless hours of practice and performance. Bobby added harmony on the chorus, his voice rougher than Emma's but warm and enthusiastic. And then, almost without conscious decision, Jake began to sing. His voice cracked on the first few words from disuse and emotion and the simple shock of hearing himself make music with other people again. But as the song progressed, something magical began to happen. The three voices found each other, circling and supporting and lifting until they created something larger than the sum of their individual parts. When the song ended, the garage fell silent except for the whir of the fan and the distant sound of traffic. Jake could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, but it wasn't the panicked racing of anxiety. It was the elevated pulse of exhilaration. "Holy shit," Bobby breathed, his eyes wide with wonder. "Jake, man, you sound incredible. Better than before, even." Emma was staring at Jake with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. "That was beautiful," she said quietly. "Really, truly beautiful." Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I'm out of practice. My timing was off, and I cracked on that high note in the bridge." "Shut up," Emma said with a laugh. "You're not allowed to be self-deprecating right now. What you just did took real courage, and it sounded amazing." The praise felt foreign and overwhelming, like trying to swallow sunlight. Jake had grown so accustomed to isolation and self-criticism that genuine compliments felt almost aggressive in their positivity. "What should we try next?" he asked, deflecting the attention back to the group. They worked through a dozen songs over the next 2 hours, ranging from classic country standards to more contemporary fare. Jake's voice grew stronger and more confident with each performance, and he found himself taking risks he hadn't attempted in years. Vocal runs, harmony parts, even a few bars of lead guitar on "The Devil Went Down to Georgia" that made Bobby whoop with delight. But it was when Emma suggested they try Troubadour that everything clicked into place. The George Strait song had been one of Michael's favorites, and Jake had performed it countless times at Murphy's Tavern during his brief career as a local performer. As his fingers found the opening chords, he could almost feel his father's presence in the garage, not as a source of guilt or grief, but as a warm, encouraging presence that seemed to say, "This is who you're meant to be, son. This is what you were born to do." Jake's voice soared on the chorus, clear and strong and filled with the kind of emotional authenticity that couldn't be manufactured or faked. Emma's harmony was perfect, supportive without being overwhelming, complimentary without being competitive. Bobby's rhythm guitar provided a steady foundation that allowed the vocals to take flight. When the song ended, tears were streaming down Jake's face. But for the first time since his father's death, they weren't tears of loss or regret. They were tears of connection, of recognition, of coming home to a part of himself he had thought was buried forever. "Jake," Emma said softly, reaching over to squeeze his hand. I don't even have words for what that was." "Your dad would have lost his damn mind," Bobby added, his own voice thick with emotion. "He would have been so proud, man, so incredibly proud." Jake wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, feeling simultaneously vulnerable and exhilarated. "I can hear him," he said quietly. "When we're playing, I can actually hear his voice harmonizing with ours." Emma and Bobby exchanged a look that Jake caught this time, not conspiratorial, but deeply moved. "Maybe that's how it's supposed to work," Emma suggested. "Maybe the people we love never really leave us. Maybe they just become part of the music we make." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the driveway. Maria Martinez appeared in the garage doorway, carrying a tray of iced tea and homemade cookies. Bobby's mother was a small woman with graying hair and kind eyes who had treated Jake like a second son since elementary school. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Maria said in accented English, though Jake knew she spoke both languages fluently. "I thought you might be thirsty." "Mom, you're an angel," Bobby said, jumping up to help her with the tray. "Jake, Emma, you remember my mom." "Mrs. Martinez, thank you so much," Jake said, accepting a glass of sweet tea gratefully. "And thank you for letting us use the garage." "Mijo, this garage has been too quiet for too long," Maria replied warmly. "It makes my heart happy to hear music in here again." She turned to Emma with a smile. "And you, querida, you have a voice like an angel, like Selena, but country." Emma beamed at the compliment. "That's incredibly kind of you to say." After Maria returned to the house, the three friends sat in comfortable silence, sipping their drinks and processing what had just happened. The late afternoon sun slanted through the garage door, painting everything in golden light that seemed to transform the mundane space into something almost sacred. "So," Bobby said finally, "I'm going to ask the question we're all thinking. Are we doing this audition thing or what?" Jake felt his stomach clench at the mention of the George Strait audition. Playing in Bobby's garage with two supportive friends was one thing. Performing in front of judges and competing against seasoned professionals was something else entirely. "I don't know if I'm ready for something that big," Jake said honestly. "This is the first time I've played with other people in almost 2 years. Jumping straight to a major audition seems like a lot." "But what if we started smaller?" Emma suggested. "There's an open mic at the Saxon pub next Thursday. Very low-key, supportive crowd. Maybe we could try one song there, just to see how it feels." The suggestion made Jake's palms sweat, but it also sparked something that might have been anticipation in his chest. The Saxon pub was legendary among Austin musicians, a place where careers had been launched and legends had been born, but also where newcomers were welcomed with open arms and gentle encouragement. "Just one song?" Jake asked. "Just one song," Emma confirmed. "And if it goes well, maybe we think about the audition. If it doesn't, we come back here and keep working until you feel ready." Bobby was practically vibrating with excitement. "Dude, this is perfect. Baby steps, just like we talked about. And the Saxon has that super intimate vibe. It's like playing in someone's living room." Jake thought about his father's advice from years ago. Sometimes the best way to get over being afraid of something is to do it badly a few times, until it stops seeming so scary. "Okay," Jake said, the word coming out before he could second-guess himself. "Okay, let's try the Saxon. One song." Emma's smile was radiant. "Which song?" Jake looked at his guitar, then at his two friends, then out at the golden Austin afternoon. "Troubadour," he said with more confidence than he felt. "If we're going to do this, we might as well do it right." As they began to work through the arrangement again, Jake found himself thinking about the George Strait audition announcement that still sat folded in his wallet. The deadline was 2 weeks away, plenty of time to build up his confidence with smaller performances, or plenty of time to talk himself out of the whole crazy idea. But for the first time since his father's death, Jake Sullivan was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, he might be ready to step back into the light. "You know what?" he said suddenly, interrupting their rehearsal. "If the Saxon goes well, I want to try the audition." Bobby's whoop of joy could probably be heard 3 blocks away, and Emma's hug nearly knocked Jake off his chair. As his friends celebrated around him, Jake felt something that had been dormant for almost 2 years, finally stirring to life. The belief that his best days might still be ahead of him. The Frank Irwin Center buzzed with an energy that seemed to vibrate in Jake's bones as he stood backstage, guitar in hand, trying to process the surreal reality of his situation. 3 weeks had passed since that afternoon in Bobby's garage. 3 weeks that had transformed his life in ways he never could have imagined. The open mic night at the Saxon pub had gone better than anyone had dared hope, with their performance of Troubadour earning a standing ovation and several offers from local venue owners. Word had spread quickly through Austin's tight-knit music community about the young man with the golden voice who had emerged from 2 years of self-imposed exile. The audition itself had been a blur of nerves and adrenaline. Jake, Emma, and Bobby had performed their arrangement of Troubadour for a panel of judges that included George Strait's tour manager, a representative from his record label, and the legendary King of Country himself, sitting quietly in the back of the room with his trademark hat pulled low over his eyes. When their names were called as the winners, Jake had nearly fainted from shock and relief. Now, with less than an hour before the show began, Jake found himself in the surreal position of preparing to open for his childhood hero in front of 20,000 people. The venue was sold out, with fans who had traveled from across Texas and beyond to witness what was being billed as a historic homecoming performance. "Jake, you need to eat something," Linda Sullivan said, approaching her son with a plate of barbecue from the catering spread. She wore her best dress, a navy blue number she had bought specifically for this occasion, and her eyes sparkled with tears of pride and joy. "You're going to make yourself sick from nerves if you don't get some food in your stomach." "I can't eat, Mom," Jake replied, his hands shaking slightly as he tuned his guitar for the 10th time. "I feel like I'm going to throw up as it is." The backstage area was organized chaos, with roadies moving equipment, sound engineers conducting last-minute checks, and various personnel wearing headsets and clipboards rushing back and forth with the urgency of people managing a major production. Jake felt simultaneously crucial and invisible, like he was both the center of everything and completely irrelevant. Emma appeared at his side, looking stunning in a flowing white dress that made her look like some kind of country music angel. She had spent the morning at a salon, getting her hair and makeup done professionally. A luxury that felt both exciting and terrifying to someone used to performing in dive bars and coffee shops. "How are you holding up?" she asked, placing a steadying hand on Jake's arm. "I'm oscillating between complete terror and absolute disbelief," Jake admitted. "This morning I woke up convinced this was all an elaborate dream." Bobby bounded over, practically glowing with excitement. He had traded his usual t-shirt and jeans for black slacks and a white button-down that made him look almost responsible. "Guys, I just talked to George Strait's guitar tech and he said Mr. Strait specifically requested to meet us before we go on. The King of Country wants to meet us." The announcement sent a fresh wave of anxiety through Jake's system. Meeting George Strait had been a fantasy for so long that the prospect of it becoming reality felt overwhelming. What do you say to someone whose music has soundtracked your entire life? How do you express gratitude to an artist whose songs helped you survive the worst period of your existence? "Jake?" a voice called from across the backstage area. "Jake Sullivan?" Jake turned to see a woman in her 50s approaching, wearing a headset and carrying a clipboard. Her expression was professionally friendly, but urgent. "I'm Rebecca Chen, mister." Strait's tour manager, she said, extending her hand. George would like a word with you before the show begins, if you have a minute. Jake's mouth went dry. Of course. Absolutely. Rebecca led Jake through a maze of equipment cases and cables to a quiet corner of the backstage area that had been set up as an impromptu meeting space. And there, sitting in a folding chair and looking remarkably like any other middle-aged Texan, was George Strait himself. The king of country was smaller in person than Jake had expected, but his presence filled the space in a way that defied physics. He wore his signature cowboy hat and a simple white shirt, and his famous smile was warm and genuine as he stood to shake Jake's hand. "Jake Sullivan," George said, his voice carrying the same smooth tones that had made him famous. "I've been looking forward to meeting you, son. That audition of yours was something special." Jake struggled to find words. "Mr. Strait, I can't even... Thank you for this opportunity, sir. It means more than you could ever know." "Call me George," the country legend said with a chuckle. "And from what I've heard, you've earned this opportunity. Rebecca tells me you've had a tough few years." Jake nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. "I lost my own daddy when I was about your age," George continued, his tone growing more serious. "Car accident, just like yours. And I know how that kind of loss can make you question everything you thought you knew about yourself and your place in the world." The unexpected personal revelation hit Jake like a physical blow. He had known the basic facts of George Strait's biography, but hearing the country star speak so openly about his own experience with loss created an instant connection that transcended their difference in fame and success. How did you keep going?" Jake asked quietly. George smiled, and Jake could see decades of wisdom and experience in his eyes. "Same way you did, son. One day at a time, one song at a time. Music has a way of healing things that medicine and time can't touch. It gives us a way to transform our pain into something beautiful, something that might help somebody else who's walking that same dark road." Jake felt tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. "My dad was your biggest fan. He used to say that listening to your music was like having a conversation with an old friend." "Your daddy sounds like he was a wise man," George replied. "And I bet he's watching tonight, prouder than a rooster in a henhouse." The sound of the crowd filtering into the arena grew louder, a steady rumble of anticipation and excitement. Jake could feel the energy building, could sense the weight of 20,000 people gathering to witness something special. "I should probably let you get ready," George said, standing and placing a fatherly hand on Jake's shoulder. "But I want you to know something, son. Tonight isn't about proving anything to anybody. It's about sharing the gift you've been given with people who need to hear it. Trust your instincts, sing from your heart, and everything else will take care of itself." As George walked away to prepare for his own performance, Jake stood frozen in the backstage chaos, processing what had just happened. The king of country, his idol, his inspiration, the voice of his childhood, had shared something deeply personal with him, had offered encouragement and wisdom that felt like a blessing from the universe itself. "Jake!" Emma called out, hurrying over with Bobby close behind. "It's time. They're calling places." The next few minutes passed in a blur of final sound checks, quick hugs from his mother, and the strange ritual of walking from the relative calm of backstage to the blazing lights and deafening noise of the stage. Jake had performed in front of crowds before, but never anything approaching this scale. The Frank Irwin Center stretched out before them like a sea of faces, each one representing a person who had chosen to spend their evening listening to music. As Jake stepped up to the microphone, his guitar slung across his shoulder, he felt the familiar flutter of panic in his chest. 20,000 pairs of eyes focused on him, 20,000 people waiting to judge whether he belonged on this stage. His hands began to shake, and for a moment he was certain he was about to humiliate himself in the most spectacular way possible. But then he heard Emma's voice, warm and steady beside him. "We've got this, Jake." Just like in the garage. And Bobby grinning like a maniac as he counted them in. 1, 2, 3, 4. The opening chords of Troubadour rang out through the arena, clear and true and filled with all the emotion Jake had been carrying for the past 2 years. And then he began to sing. His voice, strong and clear and achingly beautiful, soared over the crowd like a prayer. The lyrics, about a traveling musician carrying stories and songs from town to town, took on new meaning in this context, becoming a testament to the power of music to connect strangers and transform ordinary moments into something transcendent. Emma's harmony wove around his melody like silk, and Bobby's rhythm guitar provided the steady heartbeat that held everything together. But it was Jake's voice that commanded the arena, that reached into the hearts of 20,000 people and reminded them why they had fallen in love with country music in the first place. As the song reached its climax, Jake felt something shift inside him. The fear that had dominated his life for 2 years began to dissolve, replaced by something that felt like coming home. This was where he belonged, not hiding in empty bars or isolated houses, but here, sharing his gift with people who needed to hear it. When the final chord rang out, the arena erupted in applause that seemed to shake the building's foundations. Jake stood at the microphone, overwhelmed by the response, and for the first time since his father's death, he felt genuinely happy. But the greatest surprise was yet to come. As the applause began to die down, George Strait himself walked onto the stage, his presence commanding instant attention from the crowd. "Folks," George said into his microphone, his voice carrying easily through the arena, "in 40 years of making music, I've heard a lot of young singers. Most of them are talented, some of them are special, and every once in a while you hear someone who reminds you why you fell in love with music in the first place." Jake's heart began to race as he realized what was happening. "Jake Sullivan," George continued, turning to face him directly, "would you do me the honor of staying up here and singing one more song with me?" The crowd's roar was deafening. Jake looked at Emma and Bobby, both of whom were grinning and nodding encouragement, then back at George Strait, who was extending his hand in invitation. "What song?" Jake managed to ask, his voice barely audible over the crowd noise. George smiled, and Jake could see the mischief in his eyes. "How about Amarillo Morning? I think your daddy would approve." The mention of Michael Sullivan, the reference to the song that had been playing in Jake's head for 2 years. The recognition that this moment was as much about honoring his father's memory as it was about launching his own career. It all hit Jake at once, and he felt tears streaming down his face. But he nodded, stepped up to share George's microphone, and began to sing the song that had carried him through his darkest days. Their voices blended perfectly, 2 generations of Texas musicians creating something magical in front of an audience that would remember this moment for the rest of their lives. George's seasoned professionalism complemented Jake's raw emotion, and together they created a performance that transcended entertainment and became something approaching spiritual experience. As the song ended and the arena exploded in applause, George put his arm around Jake's shoulders and spoke directly into his ear, though the microphone picked up his words for the entire crowd to hear. "Welcome to the family, son. Your daddy would be so proud." Jake looked out at the sea of faces, all of them on their feet, all of them sharing in this moment of triumph and redemption. He thought about his father, about the journey that had brought him to this stage, about the friends who had believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. And for the first time in 2 years, Jake Sullivan knew exactly who he was meant to be. In the weeks that followed, Jake's life changed in ways he never could have imagined. Record labels called, booking agents offered tours, and music industry professionals who had never heard his name suddenly wanted to be his best friend. But the most meaningful changes were smaller, more personal. He moved out of his childhood bedroom and into a small apartment in East Austin, close enough to visit his mother regularly, but far enough to establish his own identity as an adult. He and Emma began dating, tentatively at first, then with the growing confidence of two people who recognized something rare and precious in each other. Bobby became his unofficial manager, handling the business side of Jake's emerging career with the same enthusiasm he had once brought to their teenage jam sessions. Most importantly, Jake began performing regularly around Austin, building a following based on his authentic voice and emotional honesty. He still felt nervous before every show, still struggled with anxiety and self-doubt, but he had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to show up despite being afraid.